Scots all round the world have been enjoying Tartan Day and Scotland Week. Scots around the world are well known. Scotland has been a great emigrant nation over the years. So Scotland as a nation, Scotland as a nation of union, Scotland as a nation in Europe are all part of a story where migration and diaspora are very much at the heart. We're delighted to have Tanja Bueltmann join us. She's published widely on the Scottish diaspora with a special focus on clubs, societies and social culture. She is co-author of the textbook, The Scottish Diaspora, which I still think is one of the best.
I wonder who the other co-author is.
I have no idea who the other co-author is. But more importantly, she's a Saltire Society Award winner for Research Book of the Year on clubbing together, ethnicity, civility and formal sociability in the Scottish diaspora. And most recently, she has edited a major new investigation into the British and Irish diasporas, which came out in January in 2019. Many of you will know Tanja, of course, from her blog, the Scottish Diaspora blog, and from Twitter. Well, 38,000 of you will know her from Twitter. Twitter handle of Clio Diaspora. Tonight's talk, Global Scotland in the Age of Brexit, Historical Perspectives on the Scottish Diaspora and Migration. Please let me ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Tanja Bueltmann from Northumbria University.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So first question, can you hear me all right? Yeah, great, okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. I said to Graeme earlier that I'm back in Dundee and I haven't been here for a while, so a lot has changed. So thinking about journeys, Dundee as a city, as a place, I guess, is one that has undergone quite a journey recently. The train station, obviously the V&A, all of that is new to me. Speaking of journeys, that is exactly what I would like to do today. But before I do that, just to say thank you for the invitation and thank you also especially to History Scotland for having me give this lecture today. In a sense, that's also again a story of a journey. Actually, I've published in History Scotland myself a little bit, actually a story about a journey, and I'll briefly refer to some of that today about early roots tourists, so people who were exploring their roots back home in Scotland. So we're going on a journey today, and that actually is a journey of the Scottish diaspora. And through that journey, through those historical connections that Scots made around the world, that made Scotland very much a global nation, I want us to explore what that might mean today in the context of Brexit. So that will come at the end. Our journey begins right here in Dundee in 1828. When John Jack was born in this city. He is probably my favourite Scot that I've come across in all my research. However, when I initially met John Jack, I thought, oh no, that's no good because he's called John Jack, right? You can't possibly find people with a name like that because they're potentially both first names. So it's a real, I thought this was going to be a nightmare. It wasn't. It turned out to be really easy to find stuff out about him, and the conclusion comes at the end as to why. So anyway, this is John Jack. He was born here in Dundee. His father, helpfully, was also called John Jack, just to make it a bit worse. But anyway, so here is, you don't have to make up the details necessarily, but you can see here a census entry from 1841, where there's reference to John Jack being 12 years old, and his father is also mentioned. So we learn that that was someone who was a dockmaster or shipmaster, harbour master. Some of these information are contained in different records, so certainly to do with the harbour in the city. In 1854, John married Helen Matthew Whitson, and then they moved to Edinburgh. So in a sense, they were already migrants even just within Scotland. Now, some people always struggle with that idea, but there is such a thing as internal migration. Now, Dundee, Edinburgh, that's a very short distance, but certainly if you think of people in the Highlands who might have come to Glasgow, we would talk about something like that as an internal migration. They were quite happy there. There were merchants and trading for a London company, but it was actually a Scottish company or founded by Scots. So what you can also immediately see, all these networks that Scots often utilise, by accident or otherwise, there was certainly something very Scottish about the family. So it's already that sort of connected world in a sense, even though they haven't left Scotland yet. But in the early 1880s, they decided to do just that and leave Edinburgh. and they decided to migrate much further afield to New Zealand. So in late October 1883, the Jack family left their home in Edinburgh for the port of Leith. Their luggage had already been packed and was delivered ahead of the family to the SS Iona, anchored in Leith Harbour, and that was the vessel that was to take them to London, from where they were going to take the ship to New Zealand on a 3-month journey. That's roughly what it took at the time. Now, the departure in Edinburgh was a very sad event. Aware of what was the finality of the Jacks' decision to emigrate, Peter Gardner, a family friend, observed how unlikely it was that they would, I quote, see each other again in the flesh. Befitting the occasion, another friend had brought, I quote, a nice cake. Now, so off they went from Leith to London, and there they were delayed unexpectedly for 3 weeks, and they didn't like it very much because their quarters were not really meant to be their quarters for 3 weeks, but just very briefly. It was a close, dirty place, so they were happy when they could finally leave and make their way to the East India dock to go onto the Invercargill, which was the ship that would take them to New Zealand. Now, thinking of the hotel as a close, dirty place, well, for many people, ships like that, of course, were exactly that, close, dirty places. But the Jacks were cabin passengers, so they had a relatively more comfortable journey. So the ship was bound for Wellington, which is sort of a personal connection, because I have lived in Wellington when I lived in New Zealand. Coincidentally, that's actually also where Graeme and I first met at a conference 11 years ago. No, 10 years ago? It would have been 2000. Well, anyway, something like that. Global world, we can see it right in front of our eyes. But before they boarded the ship, they perambulated the London docks one more time. And then, writing of the departure, John Jack noted in his diary, I quote, "After much cheering and waving of handkerchiefs, away we went from the East India dock." So as I said, they are cabin passengers, so they had a relatively comfortable journey, and lots of new friendships were forged, even aboard the ship, especially with some other fellow Scots that they met on the ship. So again, it's very much a story at the very beginning of friendships and connections amongst Scots. But things like the death of a fellow passenger, illness on board, brought people together generally as well. Obviously, these journeys, they were not comfortable, even if they were perhaps a bit better off as cabin passengers. 3 months on a ship like that is not comfortable. So this long-distance migration of the Jack family was something that families really only commenced on, like the Jacks, in the middle to late 19th century, what we describe as the age of mass migration. And I hope you can see a little bit of this. This is British rather than Scottish because I wanted to give you the volume of it and some destinations. This is just a table from one of my recent books, which shows you just some of the figures. So overall, they're still quite small, really, if you think about the population sizes, even in the early 19th century. But they increased generally. Certainly British in North America were significant numbers for that period of time. Now, John Jack and his family were part of what is described here as Australasian, so that's sort of a bulk label for lots of different places. It's really tricky for some of them to find out more details, especially the Far East, because they didn't necessarily group people in a really good way. At best, you might find British often, but sometimes it might just say European. So you're really often quite stuck, certainly in that early period. But that's just really a bit for context. And don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with tables and graphs and things, but as Graeme will be able to tell you, I love them, and so there are quite a few of them in my books. And I wanted to show you one, just for context, about the idea of what a diaspora even is. What is this word? A lot of you would probably think of the Jewish diaspora, one of forced expulsion, a really tragic case, or the slave trade. But the Scots don't fit that. I mean, even if we were to say that some of the Highlands clearances kind of are a bit that, it just is not the same. And overall, that's not the characteristic of the Scottish diaspora that stands out the most, I would argue. So to give you an idea, I was trying to think about how we might distinguish different types of diasporas, and one way might certainly be proximity to the homeland, because that might have an impact on how people can stay connected with Scotland. So if you are a Scot who's just moved to England, you might be able to come back. If you are John Jack and his family, well, as I said before from their family friend, that might be it. You're leaving for New Zealand in the 1880s. Are you ever going to come back? Probably not. So there's maybe proximity, but there's perhaps also a point to be made about the type of migrant that we're looking at. The Jacks chose to go to New Zealand because they saw opportunities. What about people like the Highland Clearance Scots who perhaps didn't quite choose some of the routes they went and embarked on? Or what about some of the Scottish fur traders who went to Canada only as what we would describe as sojourners, people who go there seasonally? So there are lots of different types of people, and maybe we have to think about how we describe diaspora in that context. Now, of course, for some, you don't have to go all that far to be in a really remote place that you don't know at all. As Robert Louis Stevenson said, it's only when we cross the seas that we go abroad. A Scotsman may tramp the better part of Europe and the United States and never again receive so vivid an impression of foreign travel in strange lands and manners as on his first excursion into England. Now, I've come from there today. It can have its peculiar habits, I guess, for Scots. But obviously, I'm just sort of mocking this. But there is a point to be made about this. You can be very close to a place, and still it could be really alien. And that is, I think, true. But let's look just, obviously, a lot of Scots were in London. They are not included here. But these are just some of the other big centres of where Scots in England settled, and Newcastle, where I've come from today, certainly was one of those places because of the shipyards. So there were lots of Scottish groups and communities even there. And that's where the starting point very much lies in terms of my work, of all these clubs that Scots set up everywhere. I'm interested in why they clubbed together as Scots after leaving Scotland. And you can see that in England just as much as in many other places. And the birthplace of these clubs is in England, it is in London, where Scots set up a so-called Scots Box. And this was set up really early on in the middle of the 17th century because there was no support for Scots who had fallen into bad times, basically. So Scots decided, well, if nobody's helping us, we have to help ourselves. So we're still aliens in the land, England, in which we're helping to people and enrich. So they recognize that, well, they say we're bringing something to this country, England, but actually they're not giving us anything back. No claim to parochial assistance had been established, and of course no provision made for the dark season of life. To beg or to perish was the dreadful alternative. So they wanted to help with this box, and that's literally what it was. And you could put money in, and it was distributed to people for help. And that is the birth, really, of Scottish ethnic associations, how I would describe them, clubs and societies. And this Scots Box is interesting. It then sort of became what's called the Scottish Corporation or Hospital. This is their building. You can maybe see there's lion and the Scottish symbols and emblems in the back. This is a new building they built after after a fire in London had destroyed the previous one. So they had sort of wealth, but it was for the purpose of giving it to poorer Scots, or the hospital, obviously, to treat people who were sick. What makes this corporation especially interesting to me is that you can find in their records a lot of details about members who are actually not in London at all, but who were abroad in India. So they used it as a sort of vehicle to connect. It's sort of the Facebook maybe before Facebook. But also interesting stories like this one about the Kinloch bequest, where the estate of Kinloch was given to the corporation to use, again, in support of fellow countrymen in distress for various purposes. So you can look there, for example, specific reference to Scotsmen in distress who may have lost their legs or arms or eyesight or otherwise wounded in the army. So he had a particular interest in helping those people. So there's a sort of global citizenry going on here, or a sense of duty to give back. And he gave back to his own community as well, his native Scotland. We can learn that from the new statistical account of Scotland. So this then is also our journey in England, but the near diaspora, we of course can also include continental Europe, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to tell you all that much about it, but like everywhere else around the world, Scots had very early connections. You know about the old alliance, I'm sure, with France, so lots of links, and some of the merchants were particularly important, and this is a panel from the Scottish Diaspora Tapestry. Some of you may have seen that. It was on tour in Scotland and around the world, and the actual panel has a bit more around it, but this was stitched by people around the world, and this was stitched in Veer in the Netherlands, where there were lots of early connections with merchants through the wool trade. And this is just one of the panels for Vera, the Scottish kirk there, which was the first in continental Europe, I think, certainly very early on, establishing that community through the church, basically. And there are lots of other panels. And have a look at it. There is also a book with all the beautiful panels. They are really, really lovely. And some of them are basically based on my research, so I'm especially proud to have been involved with that. So that's the general story closer to home. Now let's move around a little bit further away and let's look at North America and what happened there when Scots first arrived. It's a very similar story to what we had in London. Basically, of course, quite quickly sometimes Scots could fall into bad times. And here again, benevolence for the relief of ourselves being Scottishmen or for any of the Scottish nation who we may see cause to help, was the motto of the Scots Charitable, or a sort of motivation for the Scots Charitable Society of Boston. And that was set up in 1657, and it was inspired directly by the London Scots Box. So again, Scots going there, travelling, taking with them traditions, but also practices like this and the need for helping each other. Now, I have to say, this is not specific to the Scots. All migrant groups do this, Germans, Italians. But the Scots were the first in many locations, and that certainly makes it quite interesting to me, and they definitely were the first in the States. Well, as far as we know anyway. I mean, if there was one of which there are no records, obviously, what can we say? But so since then, a lot of other groups were set up, and they were all really founded on this principle of philanthropy and benevolence. If I had asked you at the beginning to tell me what these kinds of groups are doing, you would probably have told me they're eating haggis, reading poems from Scotland, and having fun. Well, they definitely did that too. And they were also elitist in some respects in terms of their membership, as you can clearly see on this picture here, from the Sinagra Society ball in Montreal in 1878, so quite a bit later. This always played a big part in this. These were initially, certainly in this period, often people who were better off, and they saw it as their duty to help fellow Scotsmen in distress. But they really played a very important role in the society, helping fellow Scots. And in Montreal, something happened that shows you the extent that could sometimes take. So they were talking about setting up a home for Scots who were, for whatever reason or other, in trouble. And they were going to do that anyway, but then suddenly in 1857 there was an incident on the St. Lawrence River between Quebec and Montreal when a steamer called the Montreal had an accident, and basically lots of people drowned, and it was a really terrible tragedy. And they took these people in, the ones that had survived and were Scottish, were helping them. 76 survivors were found home in the building that they were about to open, but really had meant to be open a little bit later, but they did straight away. And then lots of other people were helped by either onward travel. There were a few children who were suddenly without their parents. So they organised all of this for fellow Scots. And for those who had died, they organised funerals. They also distributed lots of other things, sometimes very practical things, wood for fire or food vouchers and all sorts of things like that. And there were lots of societies like that. Now, this is one of my favorite photographs, because I think the lady, I mean, you probably can't really see it, but she's smiling broadly and dancing to music. And this is from the Scottish Old People's Home in Riverside, Illinois. So you could also find more provisions like this for specific groups, older people, sometimes some activities for women, again, all based on Scottishness. And this was really special because you can see men and women on that photograph. In old people's homes at the time, normally that was not the case at all, and couples were being split. So here the express policy was not to do that, and to let couples basically, spend the rest of their life together. So it's really quite important. Now, in New York, we can see the extent of that importance, because a lot of the groups from Scots and English and Irish were also working together where the state failed, where the state didn't provide any assistance, and they set up, for example, a board of United Charities in New York and looked after new arrivals that were coming in through Ellis Island and elsewhere. So this is really interesting in the wider sense, because what we see here, yes, they are all ethnic associations, but really they serve a civic function. It's really important. So it would be wrong to just cast them as these haggis-eating, ball-having organizations. They've served a really important community role. There was one more group, just to briefly mention, called the Sons of Scotland, and there were others, lots of others, but they were a mutual benefit society. They were comprised primarily of working class people. It was a bit more like a lodge in terms of the organization, but the key difference is that they rejected this idea of charity and receiving charity. They wanted to basically help themselves by paying in, and if something bad happened, get it back out. So really it's an insurance company in a sense. Again, very similar patterns with other groups, and they were huge. Just to give you an example here, which compares the Sons of England and the Sons of Scotland in terms of the money that they had through the membership fees and what they were then paying out in cases of death or in cases of injury and so on. And of course, all these stories are a lot more complex and complicated, but just to give you an idea of the very different groups that we can come across. So let's leave then North America, and let me tell you a little bit about Scots in some other places around the world before we come back to the Jack family. In particular, let's have a quick look at the Far East, because the Far East helps us understand a very different type of migrant, those who remain transient and move around all the time. Basically the modern day expert sort of version of people who get posted by different companies. And that brings me to Charles Stewart Addis, who was born in Edinburgh in 1861, educated there and then went on to work in London for HSBC, and that's also how he got to the Far East. HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, founded in Hong Kong in 1865 by a Scot, Thomas Sutherland, and a few other people. There are some new histories coming out that tell a slightly different story now, so we need to maybe look at that again. But anyway, the emerging Asian markets, money was flowing, there was lots of trade. After the East India Company kind of died away, that became even more. So a lot of people came out there, and there were, comparatively speaking, a lot of Scots. Numbers overall are really low, and as I said to you before, hard to identify, because often, at best, you get British. And then you might be guided by the name, but that's also tricky. You could look at some churches, that gives a bit more detail, but it's really difficult generally. So anyway, Addis moved from London to various places in the Far East. He became one of the first bankers to live in Beijing and arrived in the city in 1886, and then also spent time in Calcutta, Rangoon, Shanghai, and lots of different places. What's interesting about him is not just this sojourning around, but the fact that in all these places he was a member of the local Scottish society. So clearly it was an anchor for him. Not least because there are lots of other stories just like that. These groups were always anchors for people, but perhaps even more so in a place like Hong Kong or Shanghai, where it genuinely is more alien than in other places maybe. Also interesting is that he went back to Scotland to find himself a wife. And there are lots of stories like that. So again, the idea that you maybe want your own kind, for that as well. Eva MacIsaac was who he married then, and they went to Asia together, which didn't always happen like that, but she went with him. Thank her for that, because she left a diary, and that is a fascinating diary to read. It's not very detailed, but there are a few gems in there, including, for example, what happened when once Charles came back from a Burns dinner, totally drunk in Shanghai, walking down the Bund and bringing all the pipers with him, and at 4 a.m. in the morning they were blasting with their pipes on the street, and she woke up from that, so she wasn't very impressed by that. But this is a picture not from Shanghai, but from Hong Kong, and that's exactly the sort of social scene, again, from a rather elite type of group. And that's the cover, actually, of my Clubbing Together book, so I think that fits rather well. So again, these are people who remain very transient and probably went back, if not to Scotland, then to England at some point in their lives. So they always maintained a really strong link with Scotland. And that brings us back also now to John Jack and his family. We're going to New Zealand. So sorry about the quality of the image, but that is Wellington Harbour in the background and hills all around it, the houses in the hills, and where the arrow points is their house. So you can see they weren't poor. I mean, they were cabin passengers, as you recall, so they did quite well. But the reason why they found that house was because one of the connections they had made on the ship knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. So you can see immediately the role of these networks. Again, this really was the social network before the social network. Now you might do a Google search and find out where you could live. You couldn't do that in the 19th century. So these links were really important. And ethnicity is an easy one to relate to if there are fellow Scots, fellow Germans there. So they arrived here in February 1884, when the Invercargill, as John Jack noted in his diary, with colours flying, sailed gracefully up the harbour. And then they got that home there, which is actually, you can't quite see that, but it's opposite a cemetery, so, but you know, it's a nice home. They also were able to utilise what was called letters of introduction that they had from their minister and various other people, testimonials. There were lots of connections they already had through that. And that's really interesting as well in the Scottish context, because a lot of people knew someone who knew someone, partly because of the small size of the Scottish population, really, and relatively many going out into the world. In New Zealand, 25% of the migrants who came from the British Isles were Scots. That's double of the population share in the UK at the same time. So that really was quite something. And so no surprise, I mean, John Jack isn't actually on this picture, but he was involved in the local Caledonian Society. Here they are standing outside one of the grounds where they hosted games. And this is a big difference, just as an aside, between New Zealand and Australia as well, and other places around the world, where they didn't do this philanthropy thing. Not really. They lived through these games. They became enormously important in the development of sporting culture in New Zealand. So you still have the same effect, an ethnic organization doing something really civic, but not through charity, but through sport. But the reason why John Jack is my favorite migrant, perhaps, is because of this story. The reason he is so easy to find is because he was the first person to ever be cremated in New Zealand, because he wanted his ashes to be sent back exactly to this place, to Dundee, to be put into the family grave, and so it was. So he died in Wellington in 1909, and one of the first things his wife Helen proceeded to do was to send a letter to family members in Scotland to ask them that they place an ad in or a notice in the papers so that people could learn of the death. But then, obviously, he was cremated. And the wish was duly observed, and relatives in Scotland received the ashes a year later in early 1910. A private ceremony was held in the family home here in Dundee. John's ashes were placed on the old oak table in the living room before the mourners proceeded to the cemetery to lay John to rest in the family grave. John's wife, however, only learned about that, of course, months later, because letters took a very long time to arrive. And she learned that from her niece, Jeannie Wilson, who wrote to her about this. So in some ways you have two different stories of a funeral, the New Zealand one where there was, well, not really a funeral, but the cremation, and then the story here in Dundee. So people like John Jack and his wife, I think, were not citizens of nowhere. They were citizens of the world, and proudly so, and with that I criticize no one, of course. While the Jack story is documented in detail, the world was much more connected then than we perhaps might expect or think. And this brings me, just as a quick one, to the thing I wrote about in the History Scotland several years ago about these roots tourists. It's my favourite story of Alexander Falconer, who was also a Scot in New Zealand. And he actually, in a sense, was the roots tourist for his wife, because he, for ill health, was given a trip back to Scotland to recuperate, but really his wife wanted to come along, but she couldn't because they didn't have money. His trip was paid for by his employer, so he went on this roots trip for her, basically, and he kept this diary for her. I mean, you know, you'd like a husband like that, I guess. You know, to my dear wife, it is beautifully adorned. He had a camera, but also put in lots of postcards, so that's actually a postcard or a cutout from something there when he went to Shetland. And it's really, detailed description of everything that he did. And in a sense, that also shows you why people in Scotland were so aware of this connected world. And that goes back to lots of other people, also like David Livingstone, where there were magic lantern shows, they were called, around Scotland with slides from different places. And he would be one example, but there are lots of other examples like that. Now, that then perhaps brings us to the question that underpins Brexit in a significant way. And I was looking for a really sneaky way to get one picture in, which is actually the best picture ever, I think. And it fits so well because it's about ourselves and others. And isn't that what Brexit is about, ultimately, in various ways? Perhaps about the Scots and the English, certainly about British and migrants, EU citizens like me. Ourselves and others, what's our understanding of identity? What I hope I have shown you is how Scots, for centuries, have been very global and have expressed their identity very positively, in a sense, abroad, have been assured in that, and I think we can see that at home as well. I'll come back to that a bit more. There's a distinct tradition of a civicness, and actually, amongst the English abroad, the same is true. They founded the same kinds of associations and expressed their identity in very similar ways, St. George's Day, all these kinds of things. At home, it is fundamentally different, and I think that explains a lot about Brexit. Now, it would be wrong to say that the Scottish story is just, in that sense, a positive one. Of course, here we have also had people who voted for leaving the European Union. In historical terms, there have been a lot of problems in Glasgow, for example, with tensions with Irish arrivals. So, let's not nice talk this. There are, of course, more versions and shades and, grey zones and all sorts of things. But on the whole, it is clear that there is a problem of English identity here, where the English have never been able really to define their identity in a way that, allows them to not constantly define it against others. That is what they do. And we can see that particularly well now, because you may have noticed since January there has been a real strong sense of anti-Germanness coming through again. And that is exactly what I mean. Why do we always have to go back to that? Can we not come up with a positive vision of our identity? And as Scott Neil McGregor, who you may all know, was the head of the British Museum and now works in Germany, once said this, and I think it's true: Britain forgets its past, Germany confronts it. Now, obviously, only with limitations now as well, the AfD sitting in the Bundestag shows us that this is not, again, either a straightforward story, but I still think he's right. And especially this imperial history, I think in England in particular. That's why it's no surprise that where very shortly after the referendum, of course, all this migration rhetoric, and this is just to give you a little bit of context, this is a study that looked at newspaper front pages during the referendum. And immigration featured as going by this table as the second most covered topic. My view is it is the most covered topic because a lot of the economy headlines are actually about immigration as well. So in the context of that, it's no surprise that very quickly we were looking at things like Empire 2.0, a new Royal Yacht Britannia, reinvigorating a Spitfire tour around the world, all these kinds of things. They have their roots in this absence of a positive definition of identity. You may have come across all these descriptions about being shackled to the EU, no ability to see themselves leading alongside others, but instead, I think seeking to recreate a past that actually never even existed in the first place. But what we've seen through the Scottish case, and it is actually true for the British case, you've been global for centuries. What is the problem in that sense? You don't have to leave the EU to suddenly become global when this is your history. Scots and others took their skills, language and cultural practices with them and shaped the world in many different ways. So in that sense, this is really an illogical argument more than, if nothing else. For me, it also always strikes me as very hypocritical. Here is a nation that has been so outgoing, has been migrating everywhere for centuries, rejecting migration in the way they are. And you can clearly see differences to Scotland there, where it is not the case like that in the same way. So, English and Scots, they were citizens of the world, using their ethnicity to establish these diasporas that were connected. But in Brexit Britain now, citizens of the world has become an insult, first dispensed, now I will say it, by our Prime Minister Theresa May. So, because of that inability, I think, to develop a positive narrative. And just before I close, for that context, if we look at Scotland, there is a much stronger recognition here about Scotland being comprised of communities of different peoples. For example, the Polish community, because it's very visible for different reasons actually, partly in number terms, but also because of the history of the Second World War and how Polish soldiers were absolutely critical, and not just in the Scottish context, of course, but for Britain as a whole in the defeat of the armies of, well, my country of birth. So that history tends to be forgotten. If you see Brexit supporters tweeting about the war, they will always say, we liberated Europe. Yes, you did, with the help of a lot of allies and with the help of a lot of migrants. And of course also of people from the empire, Indian soldiers or just, of the Dominion nations and so on. So therefore then also a recognition perhaps of the contribution and importance simply also in terms of Scotland's population development. So there's a recognition that actually we have a problem here. We don't produce enough children of our own. So, if we send all these migrants away, there will be an issue. So from Brexit to Trump, the current developments also in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere are really worrying. They sit in a wider context of a lot of anti-immigrant hate. Even though all these countries have been immigrant nations, we all are. Migration will not stop, and this is one of my main concerns, that people seem to think you can stop it by building walls or by closing doors in Dover. You will not stop it. The human race is basically founded, in a sense, on migration, but more critically, things like climate change and other challenges will mean more movement of people, not less. So that's what we should be addressing, which is a wider plea. But again, for Scotland in this context, I think we can see the differences very clearly. There is a much stronger recognition, and has always been, that Scotland is this global nation. And I know some people the other day found it really cheesy, but I think it's telling, this Scotland is Open ad, which seeks to make that point.
Hey, Europe! Scotland has a message for you. From our people, our universities and our businesses. From the bottom of our hearts. Our beautiful country is open to you. Our arms are open. Our minds are open. And yeah, sometimes our clouds are open too. But don't let that put you off. Europe, let's continue our love affair. Scotland is open. Scotland is now.
So he talks about the old links between continental Europe and Scotland and says, we're open, we are an open nation. There was quite some criticism of it, but I think historically speaking, that's actually, quite accurate. And in terms of the situation now, it is as well, because, on a more personal note, Scottish government has been exemplary in how it has been treating EU citizens, as exemplary as they can be in the context of having restrictions of what they can actually do.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Please keep
thank
coming
you.
to events at the University of Dundee. Thank you.